Good evening, and welcome. Welcome to Full Sail on Air's presentation of a panel discussion on the TV pilot, presented by Full Sail University. Before we start, I want to give a special thanks to someone who was indispensable to this whole process. As a matter of fact, it is because of her that Full Sail on Air is on air. So I want to thank Daniel Dawson for her hard work and for her cooperation and everything she's done to make this happen. So thank you. You're wonderful. As far as what we're going to do tonight, we're going to talk about the TV pilot. You may have seen the poster, and we're going to discuss what is it, why write one, and who cares anyway. Hopefully, after tonight's discussion, you will care. Because if you are interested in pursuing a career in television, it is essential that you do one. So we're going to talk about what they are, how many kinds there are, how to make one, who makes them, and what problems you will confront and what issues you need to resolve. I'm Garrick Dowhen. I am your moderator and also a panelist. I come to the platform with over 30 years of experience in the film and TV industry, in front of and behind the camera. I've worked in 2 continents. I spent 6 years working in Paris, France, came back to the United States working in television and film, and also taught at California State University for 6 years before I was convinced to come here to Full Sail and share my experience with you. I've assembled 3 very experienced panelists who have a lot to offer and a lot to share with you, so I think you're going to enjoy it. So please join me in giving a welcome to our panelists. And the distinguished one with the cane.
Laugh it up, fuzzball.
All right. I thought I should share with you a little bit of information about the people who are joining me here tonight because they are a very experienced group. As a matter of fact, together we probably have over 100 years of experience, and I'm sure each of them would rather I not have said that, but it happens to be true. And of course, with this copious amount of gray hair, you can tell that I'm the junior member of the group.
Yeah, they'll believe that, sport.
So, hey, I'm trying, you know.
You succeed.
Good. All right. To my far right, the distinguished Mr. Ed Ferrara. Ed is a former television and sitcom writer-producer whose many credits include USA's Network's Weird Science, Walt Disney Television's Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, the TV show, which he co-developed for television. He is perhaps best known for his work in the world of professional wrestling. As a storyline writer, he was one of the primary architects of WWE's Attitude Era, which saw the company rise to unprecedented prominence as a mainstream pop culture phenomenon. He holds an MFA in creative writing and is also a member of the Writers Guild, a lifetime member of the Writers Guild. To his immediate left is my colleague, Peter Gordon. He has over 35 years of experience creating and curating content, everything from live theater to digital video. He's had leadership roles in programming for HBO, NBC, PBS, and various production companies. He moved to Orlando in 1994 to become the first head of programming for the Gulf Channel. He developed the program plans and content that enabled the channel to go from a startup to a value of over $1 billion. He is an esteemed colleague of mine who also teaches here as a professor at Full Sail University. Lastly, and certainly not least, Michael Tabb. Michael is currently developing a television show with Sean Daniel. That's one of the things we're going to be talking about tonight. It is a pilot. Sean Daniel is the producer of the new hit series Expanse on Sci-Fi, the Sci-Fi Channel, and also such films as Tombstone and the Mummy franchise of movies. Michael has developed projects for and with Universal Studios, Disney Animation Feature, Intrepid Pictures, Paradox Pictures, comic book icons Stan Lee, and producers Lawrence Bender, Mark Canton, and David Hoberman. So, gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining me this evening. I want to start with laying the groundwork so that our audience knows what we're talking about. The pilot, what is it? Well, there are, let's say, roughly 5. I'm sure there are people who can come up with a few others in terms of marginal productions, but in essence, there are 5. The put pilot, that's P-U-T, put into production. The put pilot, which is the holy grail of pilot making. That's the dream of everybody because it comes with a guaranteed production commitment. And if the network does not produce the pilot and put it on air, they owe you, the creator, tons of money, equal to that of the production budget. So they figure, hell, we might as well produce the damn thing. So, it's just as cheap. Secondly, the premise pilot. We're going to talk about that and give you some examples. Thirdly, the episode pilot. Then the IP pilot, IP standing for intellectual property. TV pilots made from existing properties, whether it be a film, a book, novel, play, whatever, musical. And then lastly, the backdoor pilot, which some people thought was dead, but it's actually not moribund. It's actually functioning quite well because one just occurred a couple of weeks ago for ABC, Grey's Anatomy. They spun off a new series on firefighters in Seattle, and that's going to be on the air very shortly. So that's an example of a backdoor pilot spinoff. So anyway, we're going to be talking about all these things and discussing them, and then give advice to young writers. What do we do? How do you go about producing and writing a TV pilot, and why? So, Ed, let me start with you. You're a showrunner. You've written pilots, produced them, run shows. So, what was your approach to writing a TV pilot? What were your thoughts? How did you conceive the idea? Did you have in mind one of these genres in particular, or did you say, I'm just going to go with the idea and let the cards fall where they may?
It's really interesting because in my experience, I had several different types of pilots. When I did Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, the TV show, that was an IP pilot, obviously. But that was also one that was essentially a put pilot without being called a put pilot, because it was being developed for first run syndication, and Disney was behind it. They just wanted to develop one of their properties as a series. So I was fortunate enough to be a writer selected by John Landis's production company to develop that for the production company. And I'm rattling, I'm sorry. Develop it for Walt Disney Television. So with that, there wasn't a lot of strategy involved. It was just a matter of, developing the best possible script. In that regard, what I would do as a creative executive on the show, what I would be doing was I would do my best to develop the show that would last as long as possible. Create circumstances, create a cast of characters, and create situations that could lend itself to countless episodes over time. Thank you. Turn me off. Okay, much better.
Well, I want to get to that very issue. As a matter of fact, later on, I want to come back around and say, okay, let's talk about the decisions you make ahead of time in terms of how you construct the pilot, what kind of pilot you want to write. But in terms of the decisions you made, that wasn't your first pilot. You did one. You did one before Honey, I
actually did two before that. One was they both were essentially episode pilots because of the fact that just on a personal level, when it comes to a standard, if you're not talking about an IP per se, an already existing IP, I just, on a personal level, prefer an episode pilot because I want to give a real sense of what a typical episode of that show is going to be, and an episode pilot does that, as opposed to a pilot where it would be essentially an origin story, how we got to be in that.
Let's give that a name. We call that a premise pilot.
Right, the premise pilot.
Okay.
So, but both of my pilots were both episode pilots, and I did my best to come up with something that I thought there would be an audience for. One of them was I had a development deal with Fox, and at the time I was trying to come up with something that I thought there would be an audience for. Something, because what you want to do is, when you're thinking of what you want to write your pilot about, what you want your subject matter to be, if you're looking at what's hot right now, by the time your pilot is produced and makes it to air, it might not any longer be a hot genre or a hot topic. But what I did at the time was there was the beginnings of a wave of nostalgia for the 1970s. This was back in the 90s. And when I was growing up, one of the big shows was Happy Days in the 1970s, when there was a huge wave of nostalgia for the 1950s. So I took the idea of a standard family sitcom, and I wanted to develop a standard family sitcom that was set in the 1970s. And that's what I developed for Fox, and it went to script, and I developed the script. Unfortunately, there was another show that season that also was being developed, and it also was a family sitcom that just happened to be set in the 1970s, and that was That 70s Show. So that was what got picked up, and that's fine, but at least I look at that as that was a validation of my choice, of my creative choice at least, to develop a show that was set in the 1970s.
It's interesting you make a comment about testing the waters and having a sense of what's trending, because right now, for instance, we're trending with patriotic shows. I mean, we have 6 major ones: SEAL Team with CBS, The Brave with NBC, Valos with CW, Shooter with USA, 6 with the History Channel. So that's trending right now. So what you're saying is, or what you did say, is you would suggest that a writer not go down that path, because by the time their show gets seen, we'll be into a new trend.
Correct.
So how do you suggest that a young writer sense what's going on in the industry?
For me, it was always a gut thing. It was always being tapped into what was popular in culture, what was coming up, and what was starting to crest, and also kind of anticipating trends. As far as how to do it, my advice would always be just to be as tuned in as you possibly can to popular culture, not just television, film, games, what's on the internet, everything like that. Anything that people are consuming, you want to look at that and see if you can let that help you project where trends might end up going.
So what you're saying is that, and I preach this myself in class, is that young writers should read, whether it's on the internet or in a newspaper, but you should read a lot. Read what's going on, read the news.
If you want to write, you should read.
Kind of an odd concept, right?
Absolutely.
But as you said, you must stay current. You must know what's going on so that you can sense where we might be going. Yes, Bob?
Well, I have 2 thoughts actually about that. One, a good hint for writers, of course, this presumes that you know what has also been on in the past, but look for things that used to be popular but aren't on now. When that 70s show came up, and when you came up with your idea of a pilot, it was a perfect time. 20 years since there'd been nostalgia shows, so it was a good time for it. Third Rock from the Sun, another Carsey Werner show, another perfect example. Aliens is part of families had been a staple of TV since the 1950s, but when they pitched Third Rock, that hadn't been done for a long time. So you should know what's been done so that you can show that other things have been successful. The other thing I'd say is it's important to know what's on the network that you're pitching. It's a really bad idea to go into a room and say, oh, hey, HBO, what you guys really need is you need a show with dragons, and not know that they have had Game of Thrones on. So make sure that you understand what they might have before you decide to pitch them something.
And that goes right back to doing your research, knowing what's going on. And also, you mentioned about trends. The fact of the matter is, our society is cyclical. It is very cyclical. And if you look back over 50, 60 years, you can see cycles repeat themselves. Westerns are in, westerns are out. Space movies are in, space movies are out. Procedurals are in, procedurals are out.
Well, the other thing I'd say too, again, because we're aiming this at young writers, people who want to create pilots for television, if I'm in charge of a network, I'm going to go to Tina Fey if I want a comedy. I'm going to call up Kevin Spacey if I want a show about Washington. I don't need you guys to come in and pitch me stuff that I can go out and request. You need to come in with unique ideas that are good enough that make me think, oh, yeah, maybe that'll work for us.
That is the key. The key is to have specifically ideas that nobody else has seen before. The key is to take the great thing that everybody knows about the industry is that you want it the same but different, and it's a delicate balance. And the truth is that if you don't bring something new and dynamic to even the oldest of ideas, you've got nothing to add to the pantheon of storytelling. So you have to find a way to internalize whatever story you want to tell. I never, ever follow trends. I think following a trend is a huge mistake. I always go inside, because something that I'm thinking and feeling inside about what I feel about what I'm seeing in the world today, whether it's politics, which is easy to judge right now, and the whole world is a landscape, you look at that and you come up with something, and people will be in touch with that when you get it out there. You don't look at what's out there now, because that is things that people were thinking about 6 months ago before they made it. Your job is to look at the now and be up to date, read a newspaper, have an opinion about the world that people aren't getting and it's not being communicated through any already syndicated program, and find a way to say your unique statement in a way that nobody has seen it before. And you happen to couch that in a programming way that other people can accept it as a series that they could market. It will be either a procedural or a serial. And for those of you who don't know, a procedural is a show that basically has a beginning, middle, end in every episode. So it's like one case on a cop show, or one big medical or two big medical cases on a medical show, and then the next show it's a completely new case and it's a completely new patient. So you don't feel like if you miss one, you can't go back and watch another one. Whereas with a serial show is one where the story keeps growing and changing throughout, and you kind of have to follow it from the beginning. Otherwise, you may get lost, or if you pick it up in the middle, you'll be doing a lot of catch-up, trying to figure out what's going on because you missed something.
Can I interject on these for our audience?
I want you to interject.
There are basically four kinds of stories that we're dealing with, as Mike said. You have procedurals, you have character-driven, episodic, and serial. So a procedural, can be episodic. A procedural could be serial. But the point is there are four very distinct areas of production. You have to decide what you want to write. You want to write, because as Michael said, a procedural is about the procedure. It's about how they're going to solve a crime. CSI, House was a very good example.
Now, The Good Doctor by the same creator.
And Law and Order, for instance. These are procedurals. Serials, a show like The Walking Dead. Most people don't realize it, but that is a serial.
Oh, it's a total serial.
Complete serial. You miss 5 episodes, you're dead. But an episodic show.
You're dead.
You miss one. It's like a soap opera.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely.
You miss one episode and you're like, wait a minute, where's this character? Did they die?
Right. Yeah. Whereas an episodic show stands on its own. You can miss 4 or 5 shows of an episodic, like with Elementary. If you miss 5 episodes of Elementary, you're fine. If you come in and watch number 6, no big deal. And a character-driven show is where the character is the star of the show. Now, you also have hybrids. Somebody mentioned House. In actuality, House is a hybrid because it's also a character-driven show that is a procedural, because House drove the action in that story. But I just want to create a context for what you said, because
that was a beautiful
important.
Context laying.
Well, good, thank you. I try.
You succeed, sir.
Good.
Yeah, but
now,
I just want to also underscore what Mike said about having unique ideas. You do not want to be the 4th person walking into CBS with the Navy SEAL show, because they'll just say, what else you got? You don't have anything else, you're out.
Right. And you got one shot. You don't get a second call if you're not ready.
And the easiest way to do that is to just write from here. If you can't write from here, don't write.
Now, that opens up a perfect segue. Thank you. Having said that,
Yes.
you, as a matter of fact,
Me?
are in the middle. You
Me?
are in the middle of a pilot issue. You're working on a pilot.
Yes.
An IP pilot that you
I wouldn't
created
call it an issue. I would call it fabulous development.
from your mouth.
Baruch Hashem.
So let's talk about that.
Okay.
In the context of what Ed and what Peter said, how did you approach it? It's an IP project. Why did you select it? What was your motivation? You said right from the heart. What
That's right.
made you pursue that in particular, and why an IP pilot, which in this case obviously is in public domain?
Yes. I think it's important when you decide to write something and try to get your way. I've written movies most of my life, and I've just gotten into writing for television. And when you're breaking into a new market, it helps if because they're not going to know me for me as a TV voice. I need to give them something that they find tangible. So I chose to go IP because if I'm not tangible, at least if they know these characters in this story and it has a history, then they can latch onto that and feel safe about that because people will know it. Now, there are two different kinds of IP projects, those you have to own the rights on and those you don't, which is public domain. Public domain IP means it was created over 75 years ago, which means you don't have to get the copyright on something or get the license to adapt it for something else in order to do the adaptation. I chose classic literature and classic characters from classic IP. The reason why I chose it is because the first job, it was a personal reason. One, I loved the original material, but two, my first job working in Hollywood while I was going to college, my summer job is I was a pirate in Hook. And so if you see the little girl singing a lullaby, and at the end of it there's a pirate that goes, that's me. And I always loved the idea of finding out. But what that movie did, and there's nothing new under the sun. You just find new ways of doing it. What that movie did, it took a classic child icon and said, what happened to this character when they grew up? What happened to Peter Pan when he got older? And that blows my mind. That's a great idea. And I wanted to do that. And when a producer had talked about once to me, saying, hey, I want to do something around these characters, I said, and they wanted, and I'm like, the only way to do this is to not do them as kids, because they were saying we should do it with them still as kids and throw away the entire books and just reinvent the whole thing. And that will happen a lot, by the way. Hollywood is very big on throwing away any of the facts and any of the history to make it interesting, because everybody likes their ideas in there. And I'm not going to say whether that's good or bad. Everybody's going to have their opinion. Sometimes it's a good idea. Sometimes their ideas are good. And my idea was, why would we want to take these characters and then trample what they're memorable for? I said, why don't we see what happened to them when they grew up? And then that company was like, you know what, we're not going to do that. And then so I just developed it on my own. And then I sent it to, my people sent it to Imagine. Imagine Entertainment loved it, and they brought in a director who fell in love with it. And when Imagine couldn't get it done, they said, do with it what you want. I brought it to a producer friend of mine, and he said great, and he loved the director who was already attached. We got him, and then they reached out to one of the writers on the new Beauty and the Beast film, and he's coming on to help be executive producer on it. So it's about team building. And so, but it all stemmed from, I was involved with something as a kid. I thought that was really cool. And then I wanted to do a story about something that was really important to me, and these kids represented that because it's set in a period when race relations were at their worst. And today, we're still fighting for equal rights for people, whether it's gender or race or orientation, it doesn't matter. We're still fighting about it. I can't believe this. And I wanted to do a show about it that could deal with it in a way that is removed enough from today that we can enjoy it and then also get a lesson from it. I don't believe in soapboxes. If I'm going to do something with meaning, you're going to do it while being sure the heck entertained. And so I want you to have fun, and then afterwards it should sit with you deeply and emotionally and resonate through your work. And so I have something to pay forward on. And then I had a statement I wanted to say about it, which is the law cannot always dictate right and wrong. Just because something is legal or illegal doesn't mean it's right, because the law is made by men, and men are flawed. So the show deals with these kids who grew up and they were always breaking the rules, and now they're in a situation where they're dealing with law, and sometimes they're going to realize in order to do the right thing in every episode, they're going to have to break the laws they're supposed to be enforcing. So it's about always trying to better the world constantly, despite the narrow beliefs of what's around you sometimes. And I'm passionate about that. It means the world to me that we take care of the people around us. Now, if you can write a story from that place of passion, you're going to have a story worth telling and that people are going to care about, because I believe that people care about stories about real things. I'm watching The Good Doctor. I cry every bloody episode. But that's because it's meaningful to me. It's that, the fact that it's talking about how an autistic person can do amazing things in the world of just because somebody has a challenge, sometimes also that means they have a great gift. You know, a lot of people see people with what they call a mental challenge, and they don't realize that the challenge in this way also provides an incredible skill alongside it. It's like Rain Man. You drop the toothpicks. There's 400 and so many toothpicks on the floor. You can tell by looking at it. You know, it was that there's those moments where you're like, holy crap, you just forget that one side of a flaw, and this is important with every character we design, no matter what medium it's in. Whatever your character has as a flaw, there is another side to that flaw that is a skill. So if somebody is shallow, that also means that they really boil down what they want, you know? If somebody's egotistical, then they have self-confidence, and that confidence can sway people. You know, if they're a pessimist, you won't find them getting had in a con. You know, you got to think of characters as flaw, skill, and they go hand in hand, and that's what gives you a full three-dimensional character.
But you're mentioning something earlier that's very
Did
important.
I babble there? I think I babbled a little.
That was good babbling. That was good babbling.
Actually, before we go on, so would you buy a show from this man?
Yes,
Yeah.
I would.
If you don't care when you're going in to talk about your story idea, if you don't have that level of passion, I can tell from sitting on the other side. I can tell you from sitting on the other side of a bunch of pitches, I'm not going to care either. You have to care that much. You have to think your story is great and your story is compelling, because an average person in an executive job in television, we're hearing 1,000 pitches a year. How are you going to make yourself stand out? Just had to put that in.
No, it's very important. I'm glad you did. But you talked about social issues. Just a few weeks ago, there was an article that said television is now dealing with more and more social issues. And my question was, when did they stop? I mean, that is an essential part of writing. What you're saying is something that should be a part of writing. That's where the passion comes from. You believe in something specific about the human nature, about the human condition, about an affliction, overcoming that affliction. The Good Doctor is a perfect example. I agree. It's a very well-written show. But as a writer, you started out to write your pilot because of a personal experience. You didn't conceive it initially as a social message, but when you wrote it, it suddenly became an instrument of a social message.
Yeah, if you don't figure out what it's about for you, you haven't figured out the show.
That's the key. You have to figure out what your show is about. I ask that all the time. What is your show about? Because if you're going to believe in something, what are you believing in? You know, what is it that's making this show go?
That's right.
Okay. Having gone through the pilot process and being pretty close to going further with it, what can you share with young writers that they should be aware of when they confront situations like you have with producers, networks?
You have to know that none of it is personal. You have to know that you're going to get 50 no's for every yes. Okay? You have to power through the no's. My father used to work in sales, and he said it was simple. Every no, I had to remember, thank you. You just put me one closer to the yes. I don't know where it is, but if I don't keep asking, nobody's going to show up. And you're just looking for one, and it only takes one. And if you're lucky, one turns into two, turns into three. So now I've got a producer and a director and an executive producer, and hopefully soon we have a studio. We'll be taking it to network at some point, which is now we're in the prep process. Also, it's not a slow process. You will have taken a long time to figure it out, and you want it to be great before you give it to them. That's really important, because if at first the script isn't fantastic when you hand it to them, or at least doesn't really shine in some way that really grabs them by the guts, then they're never going to give it consideration. And the minute they do, they're going to try to change it. And they're going to change it. You're going to involve them in the process, and creating is a collaborative process. And you have a twofold job. One, including everyone, and at the same time, B, protecting the integrity of the material and not letting their ideas necessarily come between what you set out to create and what they want to include. You have to be the ultimate mediator of creativity.
Because it's your vision. You have a creative vision, and you have to be true to your vision.
Yes, and it's not your show anymore. you're not going to want to keep writing episodes for a show that lost what it was you were writing it for. But if you have something you're writing it for, like, for example, one of the tricks I do is I never tell anybody what my show is really about in here. I don't have to. I talk about the show, I talk about the characters, we talk about where it's going, and I tell them it's personal to me, and I mention things, but I don't necessarily give them. Different people regard this term in different ways, but it's what pros call a premise. Pro writers call it a premise. Now, if you ask a producer traditionally, or somebody who is not a learned writer, they will say premise is, what's your story idea? What are you saying in one line or two? That's a log line. But if somebody asks you your premise, just tell them what your story idea is. But what real premise is, a real premise is about what it is you want to say to the world, regardless of characters, regardless of storylines. None of that is in your premise. It's what does this have to say to the world? And that is that right trumps law.
Can we just add something to that? Every show has a theme. Every
Everyone.
story has a theme, period.
That's
There's
what
no
catches
exception.
you and
Okay?
engages
It has
you.
a theme. The importance of the premise is the premise says what about the theme. That's what makes it your personal story. How many thousands of love stories have there been? But your premise is your take on a love story, or your take on this IP piece and the history behind the book. The premise is very important, and I think every writer needs to understand what his premise is, because that is what the story is about.
That's what you're about as a writer. Forget the story. Stories you keep writing. But the premise tells us who you are as a writer. It tells us who you are as a person and why we want to be in the you business as a writer. Because there are a million writers we can hire to write any kind of story. Because stories and characters have been created by all great writers, and that's all great. But what makes you different is your perspective on that world, on the world. And that's what you need to know, because if you don't know who you are and what you want to say, you don't have a voice. You need to find out I have turned down jobs because I couldn't stand or stomach either what the message was of the story, or when I came in, I said, look, this is what this is about. And you know what? This doesn't work for me, but this is how I would skew this. And sometimes they will fall in love and realize, you know what? I don't like that either. And they may go along with you. You know, one of the first things I always do in a meeting when it's based on something is I try to figure out what is it that I can make better about what it is they gave me a job. When I'm up for an open writing assignment, which means the producers have a job, the studios, the networks, they have a job, and they're hiring a writer, and you know what they want. And then you get brought in along with probably 5 other writers, maybe more, and you're supposed to earn their trust and say why you should be the one to write it. The first thing I need to figure out is how I can beat the page. And by beating the page means this is what you're looking at before you go into the room. This is what they have. And you got to figure out, 1, what's wrong with it, and 2, how to make it better than they've ever had it before.
And that's very valid and right on point. But I want to keep our focus on the pilot.
Let's talk about the pilot.
That's not a job that you're going in for. That's a job that you're trying to get with a piece of paper in your hand.
Sure.
And I want to take it back to what you said about premise. I cannot tell you how many writers I've sat down with who could not tell me what their story was about. I'd ask them, what's your story about? And they would proceed to give me a 5 or 10 minute dissertation on the plot.
They'll talk
and
about
I said,
the characters and the plot.
No,
and
that's not what I asked you. I said, what is your story about?
But what does it
You need
mean?
to know what it's about. What is driving your story? What is the glue that holds it together? What makes it the story that it is? That's what it's about. I want to turn to Peter for a second, because he's on the other side of the table, not literally, but figuratively, because he's
both.
He's been in the buying side. He's been sitting across from writers and taken pitches and dealt with pilots. So I want to ask you, when a writer comes in with a pilot, what are you looking for and what are you not looking for?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, if you can't tell me your story in 2 minutes, then you don't know what the story is. You might think, and again, we're talking television, because this is pilots. We're talking commercial format where I'm going to make money. I'm going to make more money if more people watch it. You don't have to play this game. You don't have to be a television writer if you find it offensive to tell your story in 2 minutes. But then you won't get a lot of pilots. So you need to be able to tell me what it is in 2 minutes and make me care. Then that's a little bit different. That's the pitch. For the pilot, now I've decided that this is a good enough idea to give you money to put together a pilot, a production company, make it happen. If you've ever seen the first, I'm going to use a more recent reference, but if you've ever seen the very first episode of Game of Thrones was pretty much the pilot for Game of Thrones, because HBO was not sure they could make it work for the budget, they weren't sure how the castle would work, but that's why the whole thing takes place in Winterfell, because they were trying to save money. A pilot is a proof of concept. If the pilot's good, we'll buy it. And then we give you a series order, and we've agreed, we've also talked through the characters and where the story's going, all of that, but we need to see it. That pilot will also, by the way, not only be looked at by folks in the studio, in the network, we'll take it out and we'll test it with audiences and we'll talk about it with advertisers. Well, not at HBO, but at networks we'll talk about it with advertisers. It's going to be raked over the coals. So that pilot has got to be as good as it's going to be. You're going to cast it with the people who are going to be in the show, almost certainly. You're going to show the set, almost certainly. And it needs to be good. Because it's going to be very frustrating if you get close enough to getting a series that you've actually made the pilot and then we say, nah. But that does happen. The whole reason that pilots are made is because some of them aren't made. Some of them aren't given series orders, even if they're good. Ed told about one of them.
About 80% don't get made.
Yeah, about 80% of pilots don't get made.
Into full series. The pilot is just one episode, just to be clear. It's one episode that represents what your show is going to be.
Now, let me ask that question. Based on that, what we've talked about the pilots, an episode pilot, a premise pilot, an IP pilot. What don't you want to see? Would you be interested in a premise pilot, or do you write those off your list?
Well, these days things are different than when I started in the business, and I hate saying that because that lets you know how old I am. But back then, pretty much everything had to go to a pilot. These days, there's a lot of different things, mostly because of the competition. By the way, if you're a little nervous about having a career in television, it's actually never been a better time to do television. Over 450 scripted series were created last year in Hollywood. That doesn't include all the reality series.
And it's going to 500 next year.
And they're going more. So they need ideas. And as a result of that, sometimes series are going to order with just a treatment pilot, say a 15-minute pilot that shows what's going on. We talked about this, but It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia was sold on the basis of something like a 10 or 12-minute pilot that showed, this is how we're going to be funny and this is how it's going to work.
We call it a demo.
Yeah, a demo reel, a concept. A sizzle reel is something else you'll hear. When I was pitching, I did work a little bit on the other side. I produced reality shows for a while, and we would sell them off of sizzle reels, like anywhere between a 5 to 10 minute show that showed the characters, reel that would show the characters. If the network liked it, then they would pay us to make a full pilot that would be a half hour, an hour show, depending on how long it was. And then if they liked it, we would get a series order. So there's all kinds of different ways they're doing it. And if your name is Tina Fey and you have a great track record, they might even give you a series order these days without a pilot, just based on a pitch. But if you're a young writer starting out, that is probably not going to happen.
You're right, and it does happen. I mean, Tina Fey and others do, and Shonda Rhimes will get picked up on a pitch. That goes straight to a series order.
You have to earn that respect.
But I want to specifically talk about, because it's discussed a lot in the industry, episode versus premise pilot. And for the audience, let me give you an example of what we mean by a premise pilot. Lost, for instance, is a premise pilot. The plane crashes, and oh my God, what's going to happen now? And that's not really what you're going to see every week, because what you see every week is them interacting with one another and trying to survive. The pilot is essentially, in this case, a premise pilot, is backstory. That's what I call it. It's the backstory of the series. So Lost, Moonlighting, Remington Steele, Buffy the Vampire, Angel, 6 Feet Under, Frasier, Heroes, Arrested Development, 30 Rock, Desperate Housewives. These were all premise pilots. And you recognize these names. These are pretty successful shows. So what does that say about what we should be writing? In other words, how would you feel about a premise pitch? Or I gather from what Ed said, he's much more comfortable with an episode pilot, because that way he can see what he's going to get in the show. So how do you feel about it, Peter?
Well, I'd rather see an episode pilot. If you're saying which one would I prefer to see?
Right.
As a network executive, you'd already much rather see an episode pilot because that tells you where you're going to see every week. That tells you who the characters are. That being said, depending on who's pitching, depending on who's coming in with the story, a premise pilot obviously is very acceptable. It really depends on the level of comfort that you have with the writer, producer, with the showrunner. Because if it's somebody that you've worked with, someone you've had success with before, you'd go with a premise pilot. I mean, certainly you put a good list together. But by and large, if I didn't know you, I'd really like to see the Partridge family interacting. I want to see the house.
The reason I'm pushing this is because there is a feeling in the industry that networks don't like premise pilots. So
no, they don't. But
take your blood pressure on that.
I think it works if you're writing a serial more than anything. If you're writing a serialized show where the story is changing every week anyways and growing,
right.
I think it makes the most sense if that's your format. For anything that is procedural, I think we want to see what an episode is. And then if you want, later down the road, you could actually write an origin story episode and write that as episode 5 in the season. And who knows if they'll actually air that one first or in the episode it's written.
It's happened.
That's what happens. Right. But I think you do best by showing them exactly what it is the show you want to make. That's my opinion. I agree with where the industry is.
Give an episode.
Yeah,
yes, and it doesn't mean the other isn't viable or wonderful. It just means that it allows the studio to feel safer and comforted knowing that, and making shows is a risk. There's a lot of money. It's a lot of investment, a lot of people, and a lot of time. And everybody wants a show to last. The best way to allow people to feel really secure about your idea is to show them what you're giving them every week. And I think that it makes a lot of sense that you give them an episode of what they're going to see every week as a pilot, and then you could say, I have this great idea for a premise pilot if we want to go back there, but at least you've shown them, and they'll be more willing to watch your show or take your show, I think, if you show them exactly what it is you're promising them every time.
You write the pilot as an episode pilot,
yes.
But then you write a premise pilot to
once
tag
the show's
along.
Picked up, yes.
Pick up. So let me go back to you, Ed, because you've dealt with both. Let's talk about hybrids. I told you that, in my opinion, House was a hybrid.
Yeah.
And let's look at a new show. Been on now, it's in its second season. This Is Us. I think this is one of the most incredible premise procedural episode pilots ever been written because they're constantly going back and forth. Every week almost is a premise / episode pilot because they're constantly going back and forth over 3 time periods. So I think maybe I'm suggesting that if you want to do a premise pilot, come up like Dan Fogelman did with an original way of doing it so that you're covering both bases at once. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I think that sounds absolutely correct. I mean, I go with what Mike said, which is this is a very risk-averse business, extremely risk-averse, and nobody, especially development executives, nobody has ever gotten fired for saying no to an idea. So that's the idea that we need to go in with we want to provide something that they're going to feel comfortable with. Now, what you're presenting, that's something that in terms of the hybrid pilot, if you are a master of your craft and you can deliver something that succeeds on that level, then absolutely, I think that you'd be remiss if you didn't attempt that. But again, it comes down to what is the series? What is the concept of it? And I think that depending on the concept, it might lend itself better to a hybrid or a straight up episode pilot. But that's, like I said, that's based on taking it from concept to concept and taking each one individually.
I think what I'd like to share with the audience is that while our discussion here is covering the reality of the industry, I think it boils down to something we said earlier, and that is, what is your passion? What is your idea? And if you have an idea you want to tell, it shouldn't matter whether it's a premise or an episode pilot. Write it first and then make a decision as to how you're going to pitch it.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to also why I lean toward the episode pilot, because again, I wanted to deliver something that I believed in and that would have been the episode pilot. And I also wanted to deliver something that would give them a clear idea of what they would be getting, and there would be no, they wouldn't have to guess. With an episode pilot, I mean, with a premise pilot, we're asking the executives, we're saying, hey, here's the pilot episode. So now just imagine what a typical episode would be after this. It's kind of like I said earlier, it's kind of like an origin story. But we want to, the goal when you are pitching a pilot is you want somebody to buy it. Right. So you have to kind of read the room literally and figuratively and try and anticipate what they're going to be more akin to take, what they're looking to buy at the time.
I also think that it's important to note that even if you choose to write a premise pilot, you are still maintaining the exact tone of story that you're going to continue every week. Just because it's not in the same format necessarily as every week in and week out, you still are beholden to the tone and the characters you set up in that pilot. So even if it's a premise pilot, you have to be consistent with those. You can't do your premise pilot shouldn't be a drama and then you turn it into an action show starting week 2. That's not how it works. If it's a murder mystery show, then it's the pilot, it's the origin of the detective or whatever and how they got started, then that needs to stem from a mystery because that's what you've promised them, that's what you're going to give them.
And let's give an example. Castle. Castle started out as a novelist who had writer's block and killed off his main character and didn't know what he was going to do. And somebody decided to kill somebody based on an event in one of his books. So he gets dragged down to the police station because the cops immediately look to him and go, gee, this is a coincidence. And so he decides to tag along because he very quickly can prove his innocence. And that was pretty much, it was almost a premise pilot, almost, because he becomes part of the detective team. He's responsible for catching the guy who actually pirated a book with the murder. But then after that, every week it was him always joining the detective team trying to solve a crime.
We should point out, though, that had to be a premise pilot. You couldn't have done an episodic because if you didn't have an origin story that explains why the heck a novelist is working with the police department, people would be, what the heck is this? You know, so that specific situation in the pilot, sometimes the pilot itself, the story itself, and how you put things together demands a premise pilot just for it to make sense for week in and week out.
And so I'm trying to say is not to run away from it. I use Castle as an example because it's very legitimate. So don't run away from it if that's where your story goes.
The other thing I'd say is the kind of pilots we're talking about now, you're not going to make in a vacuum. You will be you pitch them to the network, which means you have to be working with a production company. You yourself have to have credits or you're not going to get in the room. And the network is going to be saying, you're going to have a discussion. What kind of pilot do you want? You know, you may have drafted something up, but you will then write it more to order because, as Ed said, you want to get picked up. You want to get the thing sold. There are also, I don't know if we're ready to talk about this, but it seems like a good time. You could just make something now. The great thing about being at Full Sail is you can go ahead and shoot a pilot. You can shoot a webisode, a first episode. I was actually this week, spent a lot of time at the Orlando Film Festival where they had a whole webisode section of people who had had credits in Hollywood spending their own money to make pilots because they pitched them and nobody bought them, and they said, we're going to go ahead and make these things. And they're done with actors you would recognize. They're done with good tech credits. And they made them, and now they're trying to sell them. In that case, though, you still have to keep a network and the TV thing in mind. Don't make a 57-minute pilot because there's no place to sell it. You still have to figure out where you're going. Those things were all structured like television episodes.
What he means is, in the case of an hour or a half-hour show, you do not have 30 or 60 minutes to tell your story because there's this thing called commercials. So in an hour show, you've actually only got about 43, 42, 44 minutes of airtime to work with, and in a sitcom, 22 minutes. So that's what he's saying. Don't come in with a 50-minute or 60-minute demo reel because They can't fit it into an hour.
That's not for streaming though.
No, that's for a network.
But what if it's
network?
yes? But what if it's streaming and they do have hour shows there?
Well, I'll give you an example like FX. FX told Fargo, listen, we don't care. You want your show to be 70 minutes? It's 70 minutes. You want it to be 42? It's 42. We'll put it on the air whatever you write.
Thank you, FX, wherever you are.
Well,
I believe in because if something is good, you have to let it. I love the idea.
Norm, but that's not the norm. That is
But-
the exception.
that's also if you're
but I
developing-
love that they're willing to do that. I love people that challenge the mold, and I love the mold, and I love people that challenge the mold, and I love that they did
But
that.
they also had Noah Farley, who's a very, very gifted writer.
But that's also if you're developing a pilot to pitch to a specific outlet. Right. You might also, as a writer, you might be just developing a pilot to pursue at one point in the future. And in that case, you're going to want to write something that you could pitch to any number of outlets, because it could be pitched to a streaming outlet, it could be pitched to a basic cable, it could be pitched to network, depending on where you are able to make the connections. So, I mean, it's just a case-by-case basis.
Well, let's build on that.
Yeah.
You said something very important. In writing the pilot, you don't necessarily know who you're going to sell it to. Mm-hmm. So what format do you use? I mean, as we all know, there's a myriad of formats out there. CBS has a 6-act drama structure. NBC is a teaser in 5 acts. CBS is a teaser in 4 acts. Fortunately, Fox and AMC are also a teaser in 4 acts. But even the sitcoms run from 4 acts and a teaser to 4 acts, 3 acts and a tag, a cold open, 2 acts and a tag. I mean, so what does a writer do?
Again, my personal way of going about this was when I was pitching a half-hour sitcom, I would stick with either, it would depend. If it was for multi-camera, I would stick with a 2-act format, with either a cold open and or a tag. Just because multi-camera lends itself much more to longer scenes that play out over more time, more dialogue-driven. So
this is for comedies, half-hour.
Yes, half-hour comedies, multi-camera, shot in front of a live studio audience.
Which means you have to have what kind of scenes? Scenes that take place on a set.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
You can't go to the railway station.
Everything needs
You
to
can't
be
go to
able
the
to be
airport.
shot on the
Right.
sound on the sets that exist on the soundstage.
Right.
So for me, when I was developing a multi-camera pilot, it would be a 2-act structure with a cold open or a tag. For a single camera, I would opt for 3 acts just because, for my own personal storytelling preferences, it would mirror the classic 3-act structure.
And a tag or without?
Sometimes a tag, sometimes a cold open. It would just depend. It would depend on the idea. Again, for a 1 hour, which would generally always be drama, I would err on the side of a 4-act, because you would look for an act break about every 15 minutes. Evenly spaced out throughout the piece, with usually a cold open, because tags work better with comedy.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you're talking a pilot, it's not that crucial that the script be exactly in the network format, because I know that if you've got the 4-act format and my network's 3 acts, you'll change it if I buy it.
But you have to have something to give them.
But no, you have to have
Exactly.
something to give them. But that's why I'm saying, when you say what format should the writer do, my advice would be, put it in, as long as it's reasonable television, put it in the format that works best for your story, so that when I read it, I say, hey, that's a great story. Oh, wait, we need another commercial break. Can you take care of that, Ed?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ed'll take care of it.
I'll take care of that.
Yeah, so
I'm on it. But for example, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And if you're one of my students, you're going to be reading scripts next week and might want to pay attention to this. Brooklyn Nine-Nine, there are 2 versions of that pilot script. The earlier version of the pilot script has 3 acts and a tag. But then, once Fox picked it up, they had to adjust to Fox's network format, which is a cold opening and 4 acts.
It used to be 4 acts, and they got greedy.
Right. So it's essentially the same episode, but they revised it to fit in this different structure, and that's exactly what happens. Because the idea is, if you pitch a 3-act show to a network that has a 4-act structure, they're pretty sure that you'll be willing to change it to their structure in order to get your show on the air.
Oh, and by the way, even if you're making a show for PBS, where I worked, or HBO, where there are no commercials, you're still not making it to the full hour, because at PBS, it used to be, I don't know what it is today, but when I was there, the hour shows had to be 56 48 to allow for promos at the end and the sponsor tags that we're going to need. And at HBO, of course, if you watch the top HBO dramas, there's a lot of flexibility, but mostly Game of Thrones comes in at 58 minutes because HBO also wants to put Game of Thrones on its international channels, all of which have their own formats. And if you start getting too off track with lengths of shows in television, it is very difficult to find other outlets for it. And we're in the business to sell our shows in as many places as possible so you can get as much money as possible so you don't have to do anything else but make shows for a living. So, do it for the format.
All right, let's go back to what you all say, because both of you mentioned it, and that is shooting demos. I'm a big fan of shooting demos, and I tell my students all the time, go out and shoot a demo. Things are so cheap today. I mean, you're walking around with a production company practically in your hand. So my advice is to shoot a demo. I mean, even if it isn't a dicey piece of work, why not give them something to look at?
Well, I'd be careful about the quality. Demos are great, really. Short demos are terrific. Short sizzles, 1 or 2 minutes. But when you say dicey worries me.
Well, when I say dicey, I'm talking about a show like Always Sunny in Philadelphia,
Right.
which if you pitched it, they'd turn you down.
Right.
And it was sold particularly because they did the
Well,
demo.
yeah, they did it. But what I'm saying is make sure it's lit okay. Make sure we can hear it. I mean, real basics like that. Don't just, if you shoot it and it looks cheap, then that will be the image in the executive's mind. Oh, but we require so much better tech than this. You just got to be careful what you're doing. I'm not saying that you should. I'm not saying spend $100,000 on your 5-minute demo, but make sure at least you set up. Make sure it's shot by somebody who knows what they're doing. Make sure it's lit. Make sure you can hear.
The most important thing when you shoot something, for me, is just to look at it and ask yourself, does this represent what it is I set out to make? And if you can't say yes, you can look, always go out and shoot it, because you can do that now. It is not like it used to be. Even 15 years ago, or shorter even, people couldn't do what we can do. You could literally shoot a show on your iPhone. I'm not suggesting it, but a lot of people do it, and they do like online webisodes and webcams and stuff. They shoot stuff to get people excited about their ideas and what they want to talk about online. But then whatever you do, shoot it. Go shoot it. First of all, it may help you discover more of what the show is about once you involve other creatives and you get to talking to people. It's never a bad idea to get ideas from other people, because it still funnels through your brain, through your fingers, into that keyboard. And it has to go through here first. So don't worry about getting ideas. Don't stress out about anybody's notes. Take them, and just remember, all it is free offerings. That's all it is. So take it and use it. And then look at it when you're done and say, does this represent who I am and what I want to do? And if it does not live up to that standard of really getting people's interest on that level, then it's okay not to show it to anybody. It's like writers, we know that if we write a bad script, the good thing is hopefully nobody's going to make it. And so nobody knows what we did.
Nobody's going to see it.
Now, obviously, I have never written a bad script in my life.
No,
But,
Of course not.
but
never.
if
No,
I
don't
had,
even suggest
if
that.
I had ever written a bad script, I wouldn't show it to executives, because my name is on the cover, and that means something to me, to my integrity. And when a script goes out with my name on the cover, the script is going to be great. That is no measure of the movie they're going to make, because the movie they're going to make, or the television show they are going to make, is going to be what they put together, and sometimes they involve the writer and sometimes they don't. Luckily in TV, which is why it's one of the great mediums for writers, they listen more to the writer. In films, at a certain point, the big difference between television and film is that the director takes over, and it's really a director's medium. But in television, you have to make sure what you have represents you and what I was talking about here well.
And I want to go back, though, to the production aspect, because that's what I want to focus on for young writers. One of the things that you have at your disposal today is people who need demo reels. So there are people out there who want to work on your production, who want to work on your show, because they want to be seen as well. So if you're a young writer and you want to put together a film crew, particularly in LA, LA has an incredible organization called Film Independent. I've been a member for 25 years, and they do nothing but help young filmmakers put together crews and get their films on digital. They have a whole list of crews that you can just go up and down the list and call people who put their names there so they can work on films or TV pilots to get exposure. So I want to go back to the listening to people, because one of the things that young writers I found are afraid to do, and that is listen to outside opinions,
That's
outside
why
advice.
yes.
You
Very
really got to
important.
be open to what your fellow creative people are telling you. There's a word that's been bandied around here at Full Sail the last couple of days, and that is collaboration. And that's a very interesting word because there are a lot of colors to that word. When I say collaboration, I'm not talking about writing with another writer. I'm talking about working within a creative community, like the writer's room, for instance. In the writer's room, we collaborate, but it's a collaboration, but we're not collaborating on a script. It's a collaboration because we're all pitching to make this idea as good as possible, because we want every script to be as good as it possibly can, because the rising tide lifts all boats. All right, so it's important that young writers understand that it's okay to listen to the feedback, and that feedback may be very valuable.
And you still get credit for it because your name is the one under it as writer. So you can't lose. It still has to go through your hands onto the page.
But just remember, they don't call this a collaborative medium for nothing. It is a collaboration. It's in the case of film or TV shows, you're talking about upwards of 300 people working together with the best they have in creativity to put your script on the screen. But it is a collaboration, and their creative input is incredibly valuable.
Well, it's easier to remember that if you look at it as these people, these 300 people, are not collaborating necessarily to realize your vision. They are collaborating to create the vision, and everybody has their influence in large ways, in small ways. But again, it will start with you as the writer, as the creator, as the mind who has come up with this premise for this, or this idea, for this pilot, for this series. But from there, it will evolve, and you will get collaboration from all different directions, whether it be from the network, from the studio, from your fellow writers, from directors. Then once the script then gets developed, then it goes to the director, and the director is going to have put their fingerprints on it, because that's what it is. It is not necessarily your vision. It is a collaborative vision that begins with you, and your name is on it. But if you realize that, then you'll have a much better experience as far as writing for television. Because writing for television is not writing a script and then sitting back and watching hundreds of people realize your vision. It's about that script evolving into something even bigger than what you had, and something that is the work of all of these people, and everybody has a point of pride in the finished product.
Which means to say, don't be afraid to take advice. And if we could say one thing above all else to our students, is that collaboration doesn't mean sharing your work. It means taking people's input, using their insight and creativity to help make your script better.
Just because somebody has a good idea that helps your script, you should use it.
Right.
Just because it didn't come from you doesn't mean that it makes the script that you're developing that much less yours.
Right.
Because
it's
it's
not at
still
all.
going
You're
through your
smart enough
hands.
to take that advice.
Right.
Well,
It's still going through your hands.
yeah. Hey, Shakespeare wrote plays to be performed. He didn't write.
You mean Marlowe?
He didn't. No, I meant Shakespeare. We'll talk about
We'll get
that.
into
after.
that's another panel.
But the other thing I want to say too, if we're talking to writers, if all you do is write scripts and send them to people, you're spending your life sitting around waiting to be summoned. Hey, I read your script, come in and have a meeting. If you can find a group of filmmakers to help you make your script, make a demo reel, make a pilot, you're going to be a lot happier, because you'll see the process occurring and you'll see the things come to life, and it will make you a better writer, a better collaborator when you're getting the big money as well.
When you start out to write a pilot script as a student, is there something you should be doing before that pilot script? Do you think a student should just simply sit down and start writing a pilot, or do you think that there should be some pre-work involved?
I feel like that's a leading question.
It's a baiting question.
Oh, that's
You
a
know
baiting
it's a
question.
question, and we know the
Yes,
answer.
one of the things that I tell all of my students, because I teach television writing, I'm one of 2 TV writing classes in the BFA program, and Professor Dowhen teaches the second part. The one thing that I tell all my students is you need to be thinking about one day developing an original pilot. However, developing a pilot is much more than just writing a single script. There's a lot of strategy that goes into it, and there's also a lot of experience that you really need to have in order to deliver a good, workable pilot. And the first thing you need to do is you need to know how to write just a script of an existing TV show, a spec script for an existing TV show. So that's what we focus on in the program, is developing spec scripts for existing shows, sample episodes. For those of you who don't know, a spec script is just basically a sample episode of an existing show written to match the format and present it as close as possible to the real thing. And that's not easy in and of itself. But once you get into the groove with that, and I say you should have at least 3 really good, rock-solid spec scripts under your belt before you even think about undertaking the Herculean task of developing an original pilot. And just so you know, those 3 really good spec scripts might be the result of maybe 6 to 9 spec scripts. But we're going to just count the 3 really good ones. Once you get those, then maybe you're ready to go on to write an original pilot.
You answered that so well.
Thank you, because I say it
Very
every month.
That's good.
Thank you.
Michael, what's your opinion?
You know, I agree. I think look, writing a pilot is a lot more than writing a pilot. It's figuring out the world. And unless you figured out how to operate within a world, it's kind of egotistical to think you can design one.
But let me ask you. You wrote a pilot. How
Yes.
many scripts did you write before you wrote
Specs?
your pilot?
1.
Okay.
How many movies?
By the way, I read a
43.
script. It's very
Yeah.
good.
Yes.
All right, that counts.
Yeah.
That counts.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We'll let you slide. We'll let
All
you
right.
slide.
Yeah, I did 1, and I loved it, and I liked it, but I've always been represented by film agents. So as I'm venturing into the television workplace, I did 1 of those for me, and now I developed this because it's hard to get staffed on any show. And when you've been a writer for as long as when they staff writers on a new show, usually they want. I mean, I hate to say it, they hire young guns. So if I'm going to work backwards, having worked in movies for 10 years as being a WGA screenwriter, the best way for me to get in is to create a new show. It's different from when you're starting out in the industry and you're willing to work your way up. People don't look at a guy with gray in his beard and say, that's the new writer for our room. That's the young kid who's gonna, there's an impression, and it's a wrong impression, because I believe that work, there should be a place for that workforce to be able to move over. But it's not as easy to have happen in the industry the way that it is. And people with the experience working in movies, usually the best way is to design something and then bring in a seasoned guy who does do television more frequently, and then you two come together and you do it. But a seasoned guy isn't going to join with you if you don't have experience having written something big.
But there is a caveat, and that is, and the Guild recognizes this, because about 2 years ago they put together a panel on transitioning from film into TV, and they had a
They've
whole
done
bunch of
that
people
panel
there,
twice, yes.
and it's for writers who want to do just that, transition from film into TV. And one of the showrunners said what he likes about that. And I don't mean to disagree with you totally.
You're not disagreeing with me.
What he likes about that is he's getting somebody who knows how to tell a story, who has written 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 scripts. Films have been produced. This is a quality storyteller. He said, I can take that storyteller and make a TV writer out of him.
Well, also remember the numbers, right? We talked about the number of scripted series that are being made. It is no longer just 20-somethings out there writing, because they just don't have enough.
Right.
I have friends. I have a friend that's older than me that was a screenwriter and has transitioned into television, but he also worked on the miniseries form. So he was one of the writer producers on the the miniseries they made of Stephen King's novel 11/22/63, and then he transitioned to a Showtime series, and there's just more opportunity. I would have said 10 years ago, there's no way somebody's going to transition once they hit their 40s. That's just not true today. And for all of you who are not in your 40s yet, so much the better. There's much more opportunity. People who were associate producers are being moved up to producer now. People who were producers, line producers, they're getting to be showrunners faster because we need the stories.
There's a dearth of material out there, and more shows are getting produced, and more writers are required. I mean, I would love to be 22 right now and starting out.
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
this
my God, yes.
this is a golden age for young writers. You have no idea how lucky you are to be young right now facing the TV industry.
I
Plus
hate
also-
trying to do it at 23.
I mean, think about what we said earlier, that last year there were 450 scripted series. Every one of-
Emmy-nominatable shows.
Huh?
Emmy-nominated.
The Academy,
Nominatable shows,
the
correct.
Academy had submitted over 400, I think it was 455 shows for Emmy consideration. I know because I had to go through them all. And it's mind-boggling.
But also, keep in mind the growth rate, just so you understand why they need writers so bad and why it's great, because multiple writers work on each TV show versus one writer on a movie at a time.
Right.
That's exactly where I was going with that.
we have
yeah.
a writer's room.
There's a staff.
Right.
There's a staff. They need a staff of writers, and usually it's half of the amount of episodes, that number of writers in the room. But I forgot what I was going to say. You guys
You're
kept
saying- you're talking
jumping
about,
in on with
you were
such
talking
great
about
things.
all the opportunities because they, you see a series, but it's not just one person writing. There's more people. And by the way, just in case there's anybody in the room or watching online who's interested in programming or development, they need more programming and development people. I remember, again, 20 years ago when I was starting at HBO, being told, well, once pay-per-view comes in and people can make their own programming decisions, we won't need programmers. Absolutely not true. Netflix has a huge development staff. So does Hulu. So does put your streaming service here. And and several of friends of mine that I worked with at HBO are working on the streaming services because they are moving to the HBO model of a paid subscriber model, and they need people. So that's where they're working. It's turned out to be a bonanza for programmers as well.
I remembered what I was going to say.
All right.
I remembered what the whole
Go
point
for
was,
it.
and we talked about it last time, but I wanted to mention it. And that is that people, when you're looking at the growing pains of the industry, people don't realize in 2008 there were under 150 Emmy-nominatable scripted television series being made. We've literally almost tripled the business size in less than a decade. Tripled. That's why they're going through the pains. That's why the writers just the big negotiation this year the Writers Guild of America negotiates their deal every 3 years with the AMPTP, the producers union, basically the producers group, whatever you want to call it. Those guys.
The Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers.
What this man says. Listen. So you look at that growth and you just have to go, there is so much room. That's why they fought for in this last agreement that they can't hold you on one show that's only shooting for like 10 or 13 episodes and then hold you for the whole year, because they need to work on multiple episodes nowadays, multiple shows in a year, because it used to be everybody was 24 episode shows and that was network television. Now most of them are between 10 and 13, and there's cable and there's streaming, and the seasons are different sizes, and the writers are actually making less now than they used to because they're making less series of each
Episode.
less episodes of each series for the number of series there are. So they literally went to bat to make sure that writers now can work on more than one series.
But there's a caveat.
But there is a caveat.
There's a caveat, and that is if you're making less than $250,000, they cannot
Which
hold you
means
to one series.
They can't hold you to one series.
If you're making more
So
than
if you're making
250,
less than $250,000
you can't.
a year.
I'm not going to cry for you.
No. But I'm saying, I'm saying, look at that and just go, yeah.
But we did fight for you, and we got that, and so that is something you now have moving forward that we didn't have ourselves. Just to give you an idea of the finances, last year, Netflix, and we're talking about Reed Hastings and Ted Sanders, spent $6 billion on programming. Netflix just borrowed another $1.6 million so they can have an $8 billion budget for the coming season. That's what we're looking at.
And
Okay.
their stock
And-
is going up, even though they're spending that money because the subscriber numbers are going up.
And
that's
they
why
raised
it
prices.
works
They
out.
raised it $1 a month.
The numbers are so good, they're actually starting to share them.
So there
Wow.
is a wealth of opportunities out there. If you do the work, if you put in the time, if you become a trained professional, and that means training, taking courses, learning how to play by the rules. The first week of my course, when I taught that, was called The Rules of the Game. You had to learn the rules of the game.
I've kept that name.
Thank you.
I have kept that name because that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
But also, like you were saying, we have all of these opportunities now. You have all of these opportunities that exist for young writers to break into the industry. The head of, was it FX a couple of years ago, was
John Landgraf.
lamenting.
Landgraf.
Yes,
Landgraf, yeah.
was lamenting that we're running out of writers. All the good writers are already staffed up, and we still have all of these series that need writers to fill their staffs. So these are the opportunities that exist for you to take advantage of. But what you have to do is you have to write and write and write and write until you get really good at what you're doing. And then eventually you'll get to the point where you'll develop that original pilot, that original series that maybe you'll be able to pitch one day down the line.
And just because there's a lot of jobs doesn't mean it's easy. Okay, don't
Yeah,
let that.
no.
Don't think. Well, I go to Hollywood and I got a script in my pocket and somebody's going to buy me because they need a writer. They need great writers.
Did you hear what I said a minute
Fabulous
ago?
writers.
Trained, become
Yes.
trained, study, learn
We're
the
all
rules of the
saying
game.
the same thing.
Practice.
Yeah,
You have to be practiced. You have to know what
Right.
you're doing. You have to have an original voice. And in television, you also, though, if you want to work in a writer's room to work your way up, if that's what you're looking for, then you also have to be able to mimic great writers. Because when you write a spec episode, different from writing the pilot like we're talking about, you have to be able to mimic the voice and be original at the same time. That whole same but different is such a fine line, and it streams through everything we have to do in Hollywood.
And let me add something to that we said before. I want to reiterate it. Writers read. Okay?
They read a lot.
If you want to be a good writer, you got to read good writing. Okay? That's a simple fact.
There are so
You
many
gotta
websites
read.
where you can find scripts and pilots.
Absolutely. And before we go to Q&A, I want to introduce one other thing because Netflix is spending so much money. They have a very unique way of working. And Netflix, for all of you, will take a submission, unlike anybody else in the whole industry, in the entire industry. Netflix will take a submission from anybody about anything. It's open submission.
What?
Now, yeah.
But if you
Amazon does that
look
too.
at what they greenlight, they don't greenlight a lot of open submissions.
No. But they do. They take them, and if there's a pearl in there, they'll do a pilot.
So-
Excuse me, I beg your pardon. Amazon does pilot. If they find a pearl in there, they'll give it a production order. Make sure you understood what I just said. Netflix does not do pilots. They go straight to series.
Yeah.
They're the only agency, the only network that doesn't do pilots.
But the interesting, you touched on Amazon.
Right.
Amazon has a very interesting way that they deal with
put
their
it out to a
pilots
vote.
because they put it out there for a vote.
Right.
They produce X number of pilots each season, and then for those of you who have Amazon streaming, you're probably aware of this. They make the pilots, and this is something that networks don't do.
Right.
They make the pilots available for viewers to watch. And then what they want you to do is they want you to vote on which ones you liked.
And
And
that's
the
the
ones
link.
that get the most votes are the ones that get picked up. The new version of The Tick on Amazon, the original series, that was picked up because that won the votes in the pilots this past season.
And if anybody here has Amazon, they just released 5. So there are 5 out there for you to vote on. There's a link. You go watch them and you vote on it. And then the one that gets the top votes gets produced.
Yep.
So there are lots of different options. And I wanted to throw out Netflix to you because they are spending so much money that don't ignore that. Now, that's somebody that I really would think seriously about doing a demo for. Particularly if I'm an unknown writer, I'd like them to see my vision, to see what I see. And I don't know how you guys feel about it, but that's something I would certainly.
I would absolutely. Look, as long as when it leaves your hands, you are really happy with the work. Now, obviously, I have a stringent policy on how many times I make sure friends have read it and see what they think of it before I'll send it to anybody. I go through it myself. I give it to my wife. I force her to read it. She's very sorry, but I trust her to be the first. And then I give it to 3 people who are not writers, and then I give it to 3 people because they'll catch the things, the big picture things, so that then once you've fixed any big picture things you agree with, then you send it to 3 writers who will catch all the little details like setups and payoffs, and then I give it to an editor friend. So I go through 4 or 5 drafts before I would send it to anybody. And you know that if you have 3 writers look at a draft and 2 or 3 of them agree at the same point there's a problem, there is a problem.
Fix it.
And it doesn't mean that it's the problem they thought it was, because sometimes you have to look through the note and see what really the problem was. Sometimes it's not. There's this old saying that 99% of the time somebody tells you there's a problem, there's a problem. 99% of the time when they tell you what the answer is, they're wrong. So you have to be able to look at when somebody's saying, not working, you have to look at that and put on your work hat. Like I said, it still goes through your fingers, no matter whose notes.
All right. We're running a little bit short on time, so I want to leave some time for Q&A. Sure. So I'd like to throw it to online first. Do we have any online questions in particular that you want to throw at us?
Sure. I think one great question you guys spoke to was about collaborative process, and the question they had was maybe in the sense of how do you interact with reaching out to people, accepting their criticism, and being professional, and just really how you can keep the relationship open and just take their criticism the best way possible.
Ed, why don't we start with you?
Well, the way I would respond to that is if you are asking somebody for their opinions on your script, for their criticism, for their notes, for their suggestions, like what Mike said, if you're asking for this, you need to take it. You need to accept it. Now, I'm not saying that you need to accept every single note that somebody gives you and incorporate it, but at least know that that comes from somewhere. They were reading your work and something made them comment on this moment in the script. And even if you don't necessarily agree or understand it, the note that you're getting, you still need to look at what's there because something is causing them to say that. So in terms of being collaborative, you need to realize that this is a process, that your vision, you're trying to communicate something that you have in your mind and you're trying to put it on the page. And sometimes it doesn't come across the way that you want it to. And what you're doing is you're asking other people for how does this come across to you? So in terms of taking it, you're going to take it graciously. You're going to be a professional. You can't take it personally. And that's the thing that you have to realize, especially as a young writer. I can remember early in my career, any notes that I would get very early when I was just starting, I felt like it was a comment on me. And it's not. It's a comment on the work. And the whole point is it's all with the understanding of trying to make the script as good as it possibly can be. And you need to weigh those comments that you get.
There's a trick.
Short version.
You go first.
I was just going to say, if you're a writer and you don't know how to make it, wherever you live, find people who are making films. They exist everywhere in the United States. And go to their sets and help them out. Be a PA. Get to know them. Find a community of people who want to make stuff that you like and get to make it with them. Then you'll develop that collaboration naturally. Don't just sit at home and think anything's going to happen if you're just sitting at home. And you'll develop collaboration. People work with each other for years and years and years. It is no accident that Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese made a ton of movies together, or now Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio. It happens at the very top of the profession. So do that as best you can where you are.
Okay.
There's a bit. I do want to answer.
Short version.
Short version. You know, There is one trick to not upsetting, and that is when I take notes on anything from anybody, you never say no, you never try to explain yourself. There are two things you do. You take their notes, and you can ask questions about their notes so that you get clarity on what they mean. Don't explain yourself. And at the very end, thank them profusely. Even if you didn't get one note that you felt helps you change the script to make it better, what they will have done is give you notes and allowed you to think through things that allow you to realize that's not what it is, and now you have an explanation for that should a professional reader then bring that up to you later, and you will have been prepared because you've dealt with thinking about it before. You can't lose by taking notes, so it's nothing but thank you, making sure you understood it, and moving on.
Synthesizing. Never argue with somebody who's giving you notes.
Never. There's no need.
Next question. Do we have another one online? Okay,
We
then
have
let's
people
go to the
in the crowd ready to go.
Put up your hand and let's have a mic.
Got a mic?
Over here.
Up there in the back.
The gentleman up in the back, final back row.
Hello, good evening. Hi.
evening.
Thank you guys for coming out. Really appreciate it. This question is open to the panel. As a passionate writer and a good storyteller, how do you turn your story or novel into a script for either a movie or a TV show? Are there any specific ingredients it should have?
Do you want to take that?
First, I want there to be light. But I'm not going to... Story of my life. No.
I wouldn't take it personally.
Ah! And cue.
Yes.
No.
There'll be a musical number when we're all done.
Ladies and gentlemen.
I think that was a time cue.
Is that a time cue? No. Sorry. Okay. Adaptation is a very unique and very difficult beast outside the world of pilot. So we're going to venture outside of pilot because this is about adaptation. One, when you're adapting anything, you look at it and you say, what are the 10 when I'm not reading it and not looking at my notes on it. When you look at the material that you had that it's based on, you close it, you put it aside, and you write down the moments that you remember by heart because those are the things that stuck with you. That's what you do. You find the 10 best and most cinematic and most engaging moments in there, and you have the moments that you would pitch that would make a good story.
Most importantly, you cannot translate a novel into film. You may have 400 pages of a novel. You can't translate that into a script.
It's not a direct translation. Yeah.
You have to literally adapt. You have to take from that story, what is it about? What is the core of that story? What holds it together? What makes it move? What are the points that move it forward? And then lift those and put it into a script form, which you can never make. That's why a lot of novelists have problems with their adaptations because they feel that everything should be in the film, and there's no way of doing that in 2 hours.
Well, because a novel is a very different thing from a film.
Right.
So, a novel is a story that is being presented in one form, but when you translate that into film, there are some things that might work in the novel that won't work in the film, and that's where you'll get the differences in your adaptations, and that's where you'll get the fans that'll be complaining about it because it's different from the novel. Well, it's not as good. But it's different
not
that
the
you
same.
can't do it.
Right.
The
It's not
way you
the same
pick those
instrument.
moments, the way you pick those moments that you do want to adapt is you realize what it is the book is trying to say and what it is you want to say with the movie, and make sure all 10 of those beats align with the heart and soul of the material. You may have to drop some of those memorable beats because they don't coalesce into a single story. You may be able to, in a TV show, hit them over time, but make sure if you're designing a pilot or a film that you're adapting, that it's one singular structure and that it's following one heartbeat, and those are the beats that you need to take and use as the adaptation. And it also helps you weed out the things that don't directly, you weed out the things because there are going to be a lot of things in a book that you're going to get rid of. And when you're talking about the differences between them, the key thing is remembering that a book is going to be written to speak to your mind. It's about thinking things through. It's about character perception. And if you see a stage production, all the story is going to be delivered through dialogue, so it's how you hear it. But a movie and a television show, we say we watch TV because it's a visual medium. It's about what are the beats of the story that you're taking that best translate to the visual medium that you can use in a story. Those are the beats that you're going to want to consider most using when you would adapt it to a television show or film.
Again, to synthesize, you're doing just that. You're synthesizing the book into its essential elements and then telling it in a visual medium with images as opposed to narrative. Other questions?
Hi.
Over here? Where?
Right here.
Over
For
there.
Mona.
Oh, hi.
They're
Nice
handing
to
out
see
the
you
mic,
guys.
so whoever's got the mic has got the question.
Hello. Nice to see you again. I have a two-pronged question. My first question is with an ensemble cast. I feel like a lot of shows that have ensemble casts have been failing lately. They haven't made it past the pilot, past the first season. They've crashed and burned. And I don't know, is it the chemistry between the characters? Is it the actors that's causing this dysfunction? Is it that we don't have enough like A, B, and C plot in order to make it interesting?
I have to say, I'm a little, if you have a specific example, I would like to know, because, I mean, what are some of our most successful shows have ensemble casts? This Is Us,
Absolutely.
Modern Family, going back to Friends. I mean, ensemble cast, it's a delicate balance, because not only do you have to have the characters that match, but you have to have the actors that have chemistry. And that's really, that's where the television director, although the television director is really in many ways, the low person on the totem pole, can really help. Because if you get a good director, they can help you meld that ensemble in the early pilots and the early episodes. James Brooks was a master at that. I mean, believe me, if we could pinpoint one reason why the show didn't work, then they would fix that and it would work all the time.
Everything's individual. I agree. It's a case-by-case basis, and you know, just as many shows that are ensemble didn't get picked up as, for my money, ones that had a single lead. You know, it boils down, it can be any of those things you mentioned, but you do have to understand that there is the added weight on ensemble shows that certain characters, when you have one lead that you're really following, like a house, and there are other great parts in it, and there are other co-leads, other season regulars, but when you have one guy carrying the show, that one person carries the weight. And if the other actors, you can weed them in and out if something's not working, whatever. But you have one, you're resting it. When you have an ensemble, you have characters. If you have characters that don't coalesce or performances that aren't working, you can't just turn to the one guy as the captain. You have so many captains. I could see how that might be a more difficult thing to engineer a success out of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question. Right here.
Hello. My question is, I kind of have two questions in one, if that's okay. The first question is, when you go into a negotiation room to pitch your show, how does that differ when it comes to pitching to a cable network or a broadcasting network or a streaming service? Then my second question is, I forgot. I'm sorry, but yeah, that's my question.
When you go into pitch, it makes no difference if you are pitching to a network or a cable network or a streaming service if you're pitching a show. Because you're pitching a show concept, they all do shows. What you should pay attention to if you're pitching to somebody specifically is what else might they have right at the moment. It's really off-putting when you walk in to a network and say, you guys really need a family comedy. If you go to ABC and you say, you guys really need a family comedy where there's two gay couples and they're related to other people, and they say, well, we've already got Modern Family on. You want to know what the other people have and make sure you show why it's an addition. But really, there's no difference. You're trying to sell a good story.
I also think certain networks, you do need to know what their strong point is, and it's okay to lean into it. Like USA used to be much more lighter and have more fun. Like they did Psych, and they had the one in the Hamptons,
Royal Pains.
Royal Pains and stuff like that. Now they're doing Mr. Robot, and they're on this dark kick. And so understand that you have to understand where the network is and what they're looking for. And you can go to any network with your story, and there will be some networks you have to understand that you shouldn't take your show to anyway. Everybody, well, I can take it to everybody. Everybody needs a show that has this or this. But no, some shows have a signature. Like Hallmark is only going to do what Hallmark does, and Lifetime is going to do what Lifetime does. Only now they will kill people doing it. No, because now they do more thrillers. But and they realize the Jeopardy storyline is really working for their audience to separate it from Hallmark. But you know, each network is going to have kind of their own niche, and your thing may only work for certain networks, and that's okay. Understand that you're designing it to go either, you know what, this is hard. This is a hard show. This is FX, maybe TNT, and maybe this one, and it's definitely cable, and that's okay. You should know what you want your show to be, because if you're like, you know what, this is more of a mini a half series. It's more of a 10, 13 episode thing than a limit. This is a limited series, is what they call it, rather than a full like 24 episodes every year, pounding the pavement, getting so much done. You should know that, and you should know what your work, what network it speaks to, and why.
Well, let's synthesize it. You also have
Synthesize.
the FX and AMC model, which is 8 and 8. They do a 16 episode show, like they did with Breaking Bad, and like they're doing now with Better Call Saul. So more importantly, you need to know the market. You need to know what your network is producing, what style of show they're producing. CBS has a particular style of show. NBC has another style of show.
Yes.
FX has a style of show. HBO has a style. Starz has a style. You have to know your market. And then, as Mike said, you have to know what your story's about. Okay, next question.
Oh, sorry.
We're running short of time.
I actually remember my second question, which is very quick. So you mentioned, sir, about how when you're pitching a show, you need to work with the format of the business. So when you are creating a show, I feel like there's a fine line between corrupting one's own creativity and at the same time, like making your creativity fit the format of the business. So as creators, as writers, what advice would you give to a writer who's trying to stay true to his own creativity and essence while still having to adapt to the format of television?
Every writer has to do that.
Yeah.
No matter what you do.
Yeah.
That's if you're feeling that struggle, that's okay, because that's something every writer does. We all have to juggle who we are and what we write compared to what they want and how they want it. And you have to find a way to meet in the middle, and you have to know you have to be able to juggle that. Each individual has to handle it differently. You just have to do it always respectfully, professionally, and always try to see everything from everybody else's perspective. Don't ever shut yourself off. I never hold on to what my vision, my idea, this is what I want to do. It's not about that at all. It's about saying something important and saying something that needs to be said. And now they're going to take the show out of that whole idea of what your premise is that we talked about, that thing it is you want to say. That's the only time I've walked away from a product, from a show, or from a movie when between drafts. Like, they wanted me to do another draft. They were going to pay me to do another draft, but they wanted me to change this thing. And I said, but if you do that, it changes everything the movie's about. And they said, yeah, but we want to do that. And I said, then you need to find a writer who can give that to you, because you have to know when you're not the right writer for them.
Yeah,
Ed, you wanted to... Go ahead, Peter.
Well, just all I was going to say is, yes, you should hold on to the important premise of your idea if it isn't your idea. But if you come into any network and you say, this show needs to be 45 minutes long for it to work, and my network format, in order to fit in the commercial so I can pay you, is 43, and you say I can't cut 2 minutes out of it, then you're not going to sell that show.
No.
And then make it 45 minutes and put it on YouTube, because you can do that. And maybe it'll be a big hit. But you'll still have to cut it to 43 to get it on my network.
Ed.
And one of the things I was going to say, and this is a warning I always give my students, which is, if you are the type of writer who you don't like anybody changing anything that you've written, if you're like this, if you're very protective of your work, television, Hollywood in general, is not for you, because you are going to have to make accommodations, make allowances, and collaborate. We're going back to that again. You're going to have to collaborate with the development executives, with the directors. So you need to be okay with that. And that's one of the reasons why TV writers get paid well, because we can adapt to that. We can find a way, and this is what our job is quite often, finding a way to retain what it is about our work that makes us excited about it, that makes us want to tell this story, find a way to retain that while at the same time acknowledging and delivering on comments and changes and notes that the network might have, that the studio might have, and making them happy as well. And you're going to have to make some changes that you might not have made otherwise, but at the end of the day, you might sit back and say, hey, you know what? The finished product is actually better because it's not just me. I had other input on it, and it took it and it brought it up to another level that I couldn't do on my own without that input. Once you can embrace that input, that's when you're going to really start to get cooking with your career.
That happens all the time. They do make it better.
Okay, we haven't gone online for a while, so do you have any online questions that you'd like to throw at us?
Another question they asked was, what are your guys' personal favorite pilots, and maybe what you liked about the pilot, or if you could change it, what improvements you would make?
Well, I'll jump in and say my favorite pilot recently is This Is Us. I think it's an incredibly well-structured, well-written show. It's stimulating, it's informative, it's emotional. There's a scene in the pilot between a doctor and the father, and I've told students in the past, if you can watch that scene and your eyes aren't wet, you better take your pulse to make sure you're still alive. Because it's incredibly affecting. And I have no problem saying that my eyes got real wet because it was emotionally impactful. That is absolutely a Dan Fogelman show. I think it's one of the best written shows on TV today. Gentlemen, opinion?
There are so many, it's ridiculous. I will go back to a show that I watch now, 8 years later, and that's, The Walking Dead. And you're with a guy who's a cop, and he gets shot on the job, trying to be good, and then he wakes up in a hospital, has no idea what's happened, no family, everything incommunicado, nothing working, no cell phone, and he doesn't know how long it's been. He now has a beard, and he's got to figure out what happened to everybody he loves and what's going on in the whole world. And he has to find out that there's zombies. And, the first with that little girl in the gas station, you're just like, every minute you're just like, holy crap. If you're in those shoes, that to me is when a show makes me feel like I did not see that coming, and how is that? I mean, I knew there was going to be dead people. It's The Walking Dead. But when they do it the way they do it, and putting you in the shoes of somebody who you understand who they are, and they give you a character you can respect right away. A cop, doing good, and then everything is taken. He has a family, he has a child, he has all, and then he's got to figure out what the heck happened. And how do you find where they went if they're not home? How do you do that? You look at that wide world and you're like, oh my God, they didn't leave him a note. Why didn't they leave him a note?
In other words, it was a very well-written show. Ed.
For a guy who always leaned toward writing episode pilots, two of my favorite pilots of all time were premise pilots. And I have to go back to Cheers, which I think is one of the best written pilots ever in terms of introducing all of the characters in such a way that you got an understanding of who they all were, how they interacted, how they will interact with each other over the course of the series. And it's not until the final scene of the episode that the concept of the show is established and Ted Danson's character takes over ownership of the bar. So that I thought was one of the best written pilots. And then another one from a character standpoint was Frasier.
Yeah.
I thought Frasier was another brilliantly written pilot where we took a character that we knew from Cheers, hey, what a coincidence, a character that we knew, and spun him off into his own series, and we created this cast around him that complemented him and served as perfect foils for him. And we thought that we were going to be just watching this show for Frasier, but it turns out that these other characters that they surrounded him with were so rich and had such a wonderful dynamic that it just created such a great springboard for what was a phenomenal series. So I've got to go with those. And obviously, can you tell I'm a comedy guy? So those were the two pilots that affected me.
Peter?
Well, my favorite pilot story goes back a long ways. But for you sci-fi folks out there, Gene Roddenberry sold the original Star Trek to NBC as Wagon Train to the Stars. He had been writing Westerns. He said, we're going to take a Western adventure story and we're going to put it out there. And so they made the first pilot with Captain Christopher Pike.
Cage.
The Cage. And it was too good. The network looked at it and said, this isn't Wagon Train to the Stars. This is a cerebral sci-fi thing that talks about man's place in the universe. Who wants that? Forget it. But if you make another pilot that really shows your premise, maybe we'll still do it. So they made another pilot, which I think is called Where No Man Has Gone Before. It was just, an adventure story. And that one they put in William Shatner. The only character they kept from the original pilot was Mr. Spock. And the network said, great, we're going to buy that. The original Star Trek cost so much money to make because they were inventing all the effects. And it was so over budget that they weren't going to make their network schedule. So Gene Roddenberry says, wait, we have all this tape from the original pilot. Let's figure out a way we can use it. And they did a 2-part episode called The Menagerie, which won an Emmy, which largely consists of footage from the original episodes. It was going back in the past. It was just a way that, first of all, don't make your pilot too good if the network isn't expecting it. And, and secondly, be open to what they're saying. They sold it. And I'm old enough to have seen those episodes when they aired on TV, and the show was canceled after 3 seasons. But look at what happened to it now. Look at what that original idea did. Look at all the series, look at all the spin-offs, look at all the movies. It's one of the most successful things from what was essentially a failed pilot. So the real story is just don't give up.
We'll take 2 more questions, because we're running short of time. Any question online, or should we go to our audience? Okay, audience. Any questions online? Go.
There.
So my end goal for screenwriting is to be an animated television writer for children's entertainment. I have 2 projects that I'm working on, one that is a pre-existing IP and one of my own, which I've done a lot more work on, obviously considering it's an original. I have a short animatic with it. Should I be plugging that more, or should I be plugging the original IP project more, or the pre-existing IP project more to get my foot in the door?
Let me start with
first thing is, does he own the rights to the IP, or is it old? Is it?
It's old news. It's out of copyright law.
Okay. I want to go to Peter because he's on the production side, so I want to get his input because that's a
without
question.
Without more details, it's difficult to give advice. I would say whichever the best one is that you have. One thing I would say for your animatic, don't make it too good, because that's an area particularly where if the animatic is just sort of black and white storyboard type of thing, but it shows what you're planning to do, that's great. It's going to be clear to the executives that that's not the finished product. If you're not going to animate it to the absolute best you can, better to use just an animatic, because that's the one tip I would have on that. The other thing is, something that already exists that you own that people hear about might get your foot in the door more, but whatever you think is the better one is the one you should be pitching. Don't pitch the one you don't think is as good.
Mike, short version?
No, I did it. That was it. I was saying, make sure you own the IP. When somebody develops an IP, I use something in public domain because I knew I didn't have to worry about the rights.
Right.
But at the same time, at the studios, just because it's in public domain doesn't mean there aren't legal responsibilities and ramifications. Studios don't necessarily always like public IP because of the fact that now they have to go look at every version of that's been made other than yours and make sure yours isn't imposing on their artistic vision of that, because that other stuff is copyrighted that has been done since then.
One other tip, and this is really for everybody, it's good you have 2. Because if you go in and pitch one and say they're already developing something very similar, and say, that's good, but we got something like that. Do you have anything else?
What else have you got?
You'll hear that a lot. What else have you got? Good to have 2.
That's
or
a
3.
good segue into what I want to make our final round, our final comments, and that's a good segue starting with you, Ed. What is the advice you would give to a young writer who is contemplating writing a pilot and getting his feet wet? Or her feet wet?
Basically what I said earlier, which is if you want to develop an original pilot, I think that's something that should be on your radar. If you want to be a writer for television, that should be on your radar. Hold off until you've got those solid spec scripts under your belt, until you understand the form better, until you understand writing for TV better, until you understand what makes these shows tick a little bit better. But then write that original pilot. Even if you're not in a situation where you can use an original pilot where you're somebody who's going to get invited to pitch to a network, which that doesn't happen until you have a certain level of experience. But you still need to have an original pilot in your back pocket, because you're going to get that what else have you got? You're going to show somebody a spec script for an existing show, and if they like it, in most cases, they're going to say, do you have an original pilot? Because they can get a sense from your existing spec, from your spec script for an existing show, that you can capture the voice and tone of an existing show, which is what you need to demonstrate the ability to do in order to get hired to write for an existing show. Okay, you need to show that you can play in somebody else's sandbox. But then the original pilot that you've written will come in handy, because the showrunner, the agent, whoever you're going to be dealing with, they want to see now what you bring to the table. They want to see what your voice is. And that's what your original pilot needs to demonstrate. And that's why it's so important. Going back to what Mike was saying, this is where you are putting you on the page. You're not trying to ape some other writer's characters or some other show that already exists. Now this is who you are as a writer, and just remember that your original pilot represents you. And in some cases, when somebody asks to see your original pilot, because they want to see what you in and of yourself bring to the table. So once you get that down, now you have all the pieces that you need to pursue a career in television.
Okay, Peter, your vision, short version.
Well, I'm going to talk not as a writer, but as an executive. It's important that you understand the business, that you have some track record before you want to pitch somebody else, before you want to write for somebody else. Because if I go with your pilot and you don't have experience, I could get fired, and I really like my perks. So what you want to do is understand the business, work on as many shows as you can. But having said that, do whatever you can to make some things. Make a movie. You can shoot it cheaply now. You have resources here at Full Sail. Make a movie. Make a pilot. Maybe it's not the big show that you want to do in 10 years, but make things. Do things. Keep working. And understand how long it can take. I was just reading in the New York Times today, Sarah Polley, who was in Avonlea, when she was in Avonlea in the 90s, wrote Margaret Atwood a letter asking for rights to one of her books, and Margaret Atwood turned her down. But she kept working in the business, kept trying to reach out to Margaret Atwood to make this thing, and now 20 years later, it's coming out just when a series based on Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale is the Emmy Award-winning series. So understand, it can take a while. Don't be discouraged. Keep working. Believe in your ideas.
Michael, short wrap-up.
Brevity
is the soul of wit.
Always work from your heart. Not just in your writing, but in your relationships with everybody in the business. If you treat everybody with respect and love that you worship, that you work with, and that work for you, you can't go wrong, because it's going to all be going through the right place. That's not a technical thing, it's a life thing, and that's most important.
My comment is simply this. There are no easy answers. There is no easy way. There are no shortcuts. Writers write. If you want to be a writer, you write, and you keep writing. Because the more you write, the better you get. You should never stop writing. All this advice you've been given is 100% correct and very, very spot on. But you must keep writing. You have to have a passion for writing. You have to want to do this more than anything else in the world. This is one of the toughest gigs in the world. Make no bones about it. They pay a lot of money. Do you know what staff writers make starting out? About $3,400 a week. That's starting out. They don't give that money away. It was earned. You have to work very, very hard, be dedicated, committed, want this more than anything else in the world. Then you have a shot at success. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have this dialogue with you. I learned a lot myself from you guys, and love this guy.
I love this guy. We give each other a hard time all the time. That's just how we roll.
But
honesty and love.
But thank you all for being here and for taking the time. It was very generous of you, and I hope our audience appreciates it. I know I do. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Garrick.
Ladies and gentlemen.